This has been my humble little gaming setup for a while, and I've enjoyed it quite a bit, never specifically had the feeling like I was missing anything. But something came over me in the past year that I couldn't ignore any longer. I always had it in the back of my mind, wouldn't it be nice if I could play all these games on a nice CRT TV, or the Holy Grail, something like a candy cab? But I would always push these thoughts out of the way as impractical. I've got a pretty small apartment, and always figured that these thoughts were kind of just fleeting nostalgia and nothing more. But anyways, something happened earlier in the year that made me finally pull the trigger, and the centerpiece has been my CRT TV and a Mister. And with this setup, it lets me play a pretty big library of arcade and console titles at pretty much hardware-accurate timings. And honestly, even though it sounds simple and minor, this little change in my setup has sort of transformed my outlook on gaming, but that's probably something I should go into in another video. Anyways, as fantastic as this setup has been, there were a lot of games that I wanted to play that were not directly supported. Pretty quickly I looked around to find a solution to this, and discovered that getting an emulation setup working on CRT and using the correct analog signal timings, like 240p or whatever, is a fairly involved process and comes with a whole host of caveats that I was not prepared to get into. Because I preferred to stick with PC, and because I didn't want to be constrained on the processing side of things, and also want to maintain sort of hands-off workflow, I didn't really consider the seemingly easier options on the table, which tended to be using modded old consoles or something like Raspberry Pi. So the most robust setup that people recommended, it seemed, is basically a GPU hack called CRT Emu Driver, which basically tricks the video card into running or sending out proper analog signals. But every time I looked into it, I just couldn't bring myself to dealing with all of the details. It's been a long year with lots of challenges, and all I know is I'm enjoying playing again. So I just wasn't eager to get into anything that might sap my energy and drive me down rabbit holes, as often seems to be the case. So somewhere along the way, I caught mention of this thing called Groovy Mister, which of course piqued my curiosity because I'd already had a Mister that connects to my CRT setup. But whether it was lack of information, confusion, or impatience, I quickly dismissed it when I found out it was essentially about sending video over LAN from an emulation running PC. I just assumed all of this meant lag, which is the big one I definitely didn't want to deal with, and just any number of messy and half-baked things that tend to happen when you attempt to merge systems like this. And then about a month ago, I caught a Reddit post about Groovy Mister. It was sort of laid out like a getting started guide, and I don't know what it was exactly, but for the first time I felt like I could see what this project was about. And a lot of my initial concerns when looking into it sounded meritless. At any rate, I still kind of felt like it was too good to be true, but since it was all laid out there in front of me and seemed simple enough to try, I decided to finally give it a shot. So the very first thing I'll say before moving forward is I decided to make this video not only because I think this is a viable option for people to check out, but that it is actually a full-featured and even ideal option, and probably actually represents the future of gaming on old hardware. I also think there's an information gap out there, which I know I fell into, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the project just hasn't been publicized very much. Unfortunately, the creator of the project, a brilliant engineer from Spain named Sergi Clara Esteva, died suddenly shortly after launching the app. One of the great endorsements for the project is the fact that Calamity collaborated on it. Calamity is the man behind CRT Emu Driver and Groovy MAME, which are probably the two most relevant pieces of software that people use for running on CRT. So him lending his expertise, testing and integrating with Groovy MAME speaks volumes, and he appeared just as enthusiastic about the project's potential, judging by the forum post shortly after its release. The other reason I'm sharing this is it didn't really sit well with me that there's this perception out there that maybe the project is DOA and half-baked. And I think in the culture that we live in today, too often we quickly turn our backs on things as soon as there, isn't some dancing monkey or mindless TikTok shoving it into our face at every turn. So if you're interested in any of this kind of stuff, this video will show the process I went through to get it all going and essentially creating my dream setup, as well as covering all these interesting things I discovered along the way about how the software works, the relatively minor bugs and how I ironed them out, as well as my test results that show just how much of an engineering achievement Groovy Mister is. You'll also notice that I'm coming at a lot of this from the perspective of the shmup community. Even if you're not into shmups, I think those types of games are ideal benchmarks for how this kind of software performs. Because if shmup players are anything, they're kind of nutcases for things like lag and accurate timings, where even the way the game engine starts to buckle and slow down is considered integral to gameplay. And so we look at these sorts of things closely with emulation. So what you'll need for this sort of setup is some sort of PC, which we'll be using to run our usual emulators, in this case RetroArch and Groovy MAME, and a Mister connected to our CRT. As I said earlier in the year, I got this Mister pretty affordably priced from, it's actually called Mr. Pi. I don't know about the name. It's just a regular Mister, but it's kind of a clone board put out by Retro Remake. And I can definitely stand by this product. It's really fantastic and affordably priced. So highly recommend that if you don't already have one. But yeah, basically all you need is a PC, Mister, and a CRT. So one of my first concerns, obviously, was how everything would perform going over a LAN cable. Because the way that this setup works is it transfers the analog video and audio signals over LAN instead of using the local GPU. Because it was the easiest way to start, my early tests had both my PC and Mister connected through the router, the way they normally are. And although I was pretty pleasantly surprised with how well everything was working, I soon discovered that this kind of setup wasn't going to cut it. I was getting plenty of random bandwidth spikes and hitting throughput limits. Although at least some of that was probably due to being connected at 100 Mbps, which is, like 10 times lower than the theoretical maximum. So maybe that was something to do with my router, and if you can see in your networking settings, if you were at the full 1 Gbps when going through the router, then maybe you'll have better luck at it than I did. At any rate, I didn't want to contend with any of that, as well as competing with the usual internet traffic, so I ended up going direct in the end. So there's my shit-ass self there, running some LAN cable. And also, the controller has to be connected on the emulation side too, so that's another reason why this kind of setup isn't optimal, unless the PC and the Mister are basically running next to each other. Fortunately, when connecting the machines directly with a LAN cable, all these problems basically went away and gave me plenty of network headroom and no such spikes. So my recommendation is to try all this out first through the router just to get a feel for it, but to plan on a setup that connects the two machines directly. This is pretty simple, and I will go into exactly how to do this a bit later. My early latency tests using this sort of setup is what first caused my eyes to really light up. One of the first tests I had done after directly connecting the PC and Mister was to record the result and check how the frames line up on both the PC end and the CRT, and figure out how much latency may or may not be present. I was pretty surprised when I discovered that not only does the local emulation and the sent signal to the CRT run in perfect frame lockstep, but actually you can see sometimes that the CRT signal is already drawing the next frame before it's even output on the local emulation PC. Take a look at this freeze frame here, of frame 2 in this latency test as an example. You can clearly see the CRT is already drawing a bit of the next frame before that frame is even drawn at all on the local emulation side. That little bit of the next frame is the red part that you see there at the top of the CRT. This was a total surprise because I've always been very meticulous about keeping a low latency setup on my PC, and the monitor itself is one of the fastest on the market. When running at 120 Hz, it's pretty much on par with CRT levels of latency. So I'll go into all this a bit more later, nerding out on latency and all that. But the long and short of it is that since the analog signal is being sent out of the emulation PC before it even runs through the local video chain, it gets to the Mister and CRT, even over LAN, faster than it can output the digital signal locally. This in itself is an incredible achievement, and a big part of why I think this, quote, no GPU trend is basically the future of these sorts of setups. So anyways, after initial tests and pretty much gaining confidence that this whole setup is the real deal, I decided to go buy a little dedicated mini PC to make everything easier and self-contained. I was pleased to find that you don't really have to spend that much. I got this HP 600G3 locally on Marketplace for about $80, and all the emulation I've ran on it has plenty of headroom on both the Ethernet and CPU side, which is helpful to, ensure I can use optimal but process-heavy latency reduction settings like frame delay if I choose to do so.
First of all, apologies for my voice. I'm a little under the weather, but the show must go on. So that's my hardware setup right there. The mini PC plugged into the Mister, and the thing on the left is a video transcoder that converts the VGA output of the Mister to S-Video. I don't even think I need this anymore since Mister added native support some time ago, so I can probably just use a VGA to S-Video cable. Maybe someone who knows better can drop a comment and let me know. On the software side of things, I've separated the things that you need into the PC side files and the Mister side files. On the PC side, I'm using the latest RetroArch and GroovyMame builds. GroovyMame mostly for the Cave CV1K games, and RetroArch for everything else, basically. On the PC side, you will want to download the RetroArch.exe patch provided in the Groovy Mister GitHub page. And also for RetroArch, I'm only using the FB Neo core. It's all I need for all the games I want to run. And you can grab this through the downloader within RetroArch, or you can download my reference setup files and use those files. I'll also have all the relevant links in the description, including all of my local reference files, as well as if you want to just do everything from scratch. On the Mister side, we just have these two files, the RBF, which is essentially the Groovy Mister app itself, and an alternative Mister main file, which is like its OS. And important to mention, you can use the alt main without interfering with your existing main file. If you want, you can probably use your existing installs of these emulators if you already have them set up how you like, but I had an old install that I was pretty sure wasn't going to support some new features required by Groovy Mister. And I generally like to have a fresh start, so I downloaded the latest from the respective download pages. For the Mister side files, you have to go to the Groovy Mister GitHub and grab those two aforementioned files. Assuming your Mister is already connected to your network, now would be a good time to grab its IP address. You'll need to enter it into some config files, and I'm also going to use it in the FileZilla FTP app to transfer some files to Mister. You can do all of this more directly by taking the micro SD card out of the Mister and plug it into your computer, but if you want to use FTP, here's how you do it. I've put in the Mister IP in the host field, and the username is root, while the password is 1, as in the number 1. In the advanced section, you can specify the root directory, which is where these files will end up going. And here I set it to media/fat. Here you can see I already transferred my alternate main file, the Mr_Groovy file, without an extension. And this is the really important part here. I was stuck on this for a while when I couldn't even get Mr. Groovy to boot up and was just stuck on a black screen. Apparently you need to set the transfer type in FileZilla, or whatever FTP app you're using I suppose, to binary in the settings here. Or else the file will somehow become corrupted during transfer, I guess. You may or may not want to turn that off and revert to auto once you transfer the Mr. Groovy file, as that's the only one that needs this specified. For the app file itself, the RBF, I chose to put in the utilities folder. The only thing left to do on the Mister end is to make sure Groovy Mister uses the alternative main file. So open up the Mister INI, and at the bottom put this clause in. Back on the PC side, the first thing to do is make a few small changes to the config files for each emulator. For RetroArch, you might have to run it once and close it to auto-generate a retroarch.cfg file. After you do that, go ahead and copy the retroarch.exe patch that you downloaded previously and overwrite the regular .exe file. And now in the config file, find the fields and modify them to reflect the values you see on the left. Obviously, the IP address is going to be whatever yours is set to, rather than what I have here in mine. Same thing for the MAME INI. Now might be a good time to mention that you should make sure to set your ROM paths in the relevant fields for both emulators, as this will obviously also be specific to your machine as well. With that, you're basically all set up on both sides to get started. On the Mister side, launch the Groovy Mister app, and if the PC and Mister are seeing each other, then you should get this bouncing logo. Hit the guide button to maybe go over some settings in Groovy Mister itself. I had to enable audio and make some small adjustments to better align on my CRT, but that was pretty much it. With Groovy Mister running first, you can then go and launch either emulator. Here I launched RetroArch, and over on the CRT, you should see the video reflected there as well. Might be also worth looking at the resource monitor by hitting Ctrl-Alt-Delete to see how everything performs when running games. Groovy MAME is much the same, though the UI might be best to tweak a little bit. I basically removed the left and right panes to give it more room to breathe. Also, you might notice the UI flicker a bit. This is only in Groovy MAME and only affects this UI screen, and isn't something you will find when running games. Once you've done some testing and are pretty happy with the setup, I once again recommend going wired for your final setup. And for that, you will want to set up a static IP on both your PC side and your MiSTer. So the best way to approach it, I think, is to find your natural router gateway. I think that's what it's called. I'm not sure. I'm not really big into networking. So for me here, running IP config in the command prompt, my default gateway in my router is under the 192.168.1 subgroup. This is basically the IP range your router looks to communicate with your devices. So by putting your static IP under this subgroup, it means that when your PC and MiSTer are connected to each other, they will operate normally. But also, if you choose to plug either of them back into the router to do some downloading or maintenance or whatever, it will also work just the same. The only thing you need to figure out is what addresses are already reserved by your router for automatically handing out to devices. You don't want your static IP to be set anywhere in this range, or else I don't think it will work. For me, I found this information by just going to my router. I got the user and pass off of the router itself and went in through the Firefox browser. Mine had a reserved range between 192.168.164 and the .254 range. So I could use addresses below .64. I didn't want to go too low since the first few address spaces are probably hardware reserved, so I chose something in the middle, around the .20 range. If you don't want to go into your router and instead just make an educated guess, take a look at your current IPv4 address in your IP config, and this will be what's automatically given to you by the router. It's probably pretty close to the floor value, and your ceiling will likely be 100 to 200 slots higher. So if your IP is something like 192.168.110, then your free slots are likely in a higher range. So a safe one would be closer to .254 in this case. To set your PC to a static address, go into your adapter settings and under IPv4, put in the static IP you chose. And the subnet mask and default gateway should be the same as what you saw in the IP config. On the MiSTer side, unfortunately I couldn't edit the file that I needed to over FTP. The changes just weren't being respected for whatever reason. So I had to edit it directly by going into the MiSTer's terminal. Also, since I'm on CRT, terminal doesn't even run when hooked up to CRT. So I had to temporarily hook up my MiSTer to an LCD to make the edit. You get into terminal on MiSTer by attaching a keyboard and hitting F9. Once again, the login is root and the password is the number 1. Then go down a directory with cd /, list the contents of the directory with ls, and the file we'll want to be editing is dhcpcd.conf. I'm using the built-in text editor here called nano, so the command will be nano dhcpcd.conf and hit enter. Go to the bottom of this file and enter your static IP here as I did under the comment # static IP. Remember, this address will be different from the one on your PC. So if my PC's static address was set to .20, here I chose to set my MiSTer to .19. You might want to add a / and 24 at the end. I thought I had done that, but it wasn't there when I went back, so maybe this is implied, but anyways, probably worth putting that in as well. You'll find the commands to save and exit at the bottom of the screen, which I believe are Ctrl+O to save the file and Ctrl+X to exit. Because I'm mostly playing rotated or Tate games, I also made sure to specify in each game's config file the rotation setting. I found it much better to modify that there than anywhere else. So here's an example of the Espagluta config file in RetroArch. The important part is the video_rotation = 1 part. That tells the game to rotate 90 degrees clockwise. And I found every game I play on my MiSTer, as well as emulation, one way or the other will support this rotation type, so I make sure to also rotate my CRT counterclockwise as well. The other stuff is just do with run ahead. Preemptive frames is basically a newer version of Runahead, but you can use whichever you prefer. The refresh rate that you see here was automatically generated when the game ran, and when I saved the game override in the RetroArch UI, I guess it added this to the file. Although almost all the games I wanted to play ran with no issue, there were a few oddities I had to iron out, and so maybe it's worth talking about some of that and some best practices I came to find. In a few cases, the screen was blank when the game launched, unless I set the rotation to 180 degrees in the config file ahead of time. Battle Garegga is a good example of this. I had to set it to video_rotation = 2 in the config just to show anything on the screen when it launched. And then after launching the game, I simply go into the video settings and switch it to the usual 90-degree setting for it to display correctly. So for whatever reason, it doesn't like the correct rotation right as the game starts, but otherwise is fine with it. Go figure. I'm not sure, there was no real rhyme or reason, and only a few games had this issue. I made a spreadsheet of all the games I set up and tested, and I'm not the type person to just throw a bunch of shit on there and get lost in a pile of stuff, so I basically handpicked the games I was immediately interested in. You'll find that most games had no real issues to report, but there are some notes there for the few games that had similar issues and fixes. Groovy MAME fortunately seemed to be a little easier and ran all the games I tried without real issue. Here's the config file for Moochie Moochie Pork. Just some rotation settings, basically. And this is basically how all the config files look like for all the other games I'm running in Groovy MAME. There's one more thing I recommend tweaking the config files, and mainly to do with improving latency that may or may not have an impact on your end, but still probably worth doing. So these are a few of the entries I changed in the RetroArch config file. And here are the ones I changed in the MAME INI file. Finally, here's me starting up Groovy Mister and then powering on the emulation PC. You may notice I'm moving through the games and emulators without having to bother with touching the emulation PC at all, and I made sure that I didn't have any secondary monitor required to do any maintenance. I set up a couple of simple batch scripts and hotkeys so I can just use a connected keyboard to run some commands for some general things like closing and launching emulators, or setting up the default emulator that loads up on boot up. Here you'll see a glitch that sometimes happens in RetroArch when you launch a game and nothing appears on the screen. Apparently the fix is just to hit Alt-Tab, so maybe something is causing RetroArch to lose focus. I don't know. I don't remember this being the case early in my testing, so maybe it's some setting I screwed with somewhere that's causing this. In any event, I usually prefer to just close the emulator and launch it again with the hotkey I set. I set Ctrl-Alt-R to do just that for RetroArch. This can also happen in RetroArch when switching between games. So one thing that I think is a best practice is to close a game by first going to Close Content before launching another one. And here I'm closing RetroArch and launching Groovy MAME with the Ctrl+Alt+G hotkey. And once again, Groovy MAME is a bit more fluid with everything, and pretty easy to move from one game to another. So that should pretty much cover all the installation stuff and optimizations. For the end of this video, I do want to go back to the topic of lag and show some latency tests with different games, because I think it's probably one of the most tremendous achievements with Groovy Mister. The thing that everyone seems to have a tough time wrapping their head around, including me, is how it can deliver not just low latency, but lower, or in fact zero added latency whatsoever when compared with the emulation running on the PC locally. Some insight comes from these forum posts between users and Groovy Mister's creator. Basically, as clarified here, the processing latency of Groovy Mister is about 3 to 4 milliseconds. The word processing is the important distinction here, I think. People tend to think of latency as something that's always added on top, at the very end of a chain, for example, but it's a lot more subtle than that sometimes. In this case, since we're emulating frames that were output at a certain rate on the original hardware, all we require to ensure no added latency is that all processing is done in the time frame below that rate. So for example, most games will run at 60 frames per second, which means each frame has to be generated within about 16 milliseconds before there are any hiccups and delays that affect the way the game runs. So when we look at the processing overhead requirement for Groovy Mister, again between about 3 to 4 milliseconds, it falls well below this threshold, leaving plenty of time to do other processing, or to simply wait until the next vertical refresh happens and send it out to the display. Not only is the minimal processing latency not really a problem at all, but actually we often deliberately use this sort of thing to improve latency when we use features like frame delay. Frame delay is a funny sounding term because it sounds like it should be causing latency, but what it actually does is delay the processing of the emulation frame as late as possible into the available time to process the frame. Again, typically about 16 milliseconds. And by doing so, you gain a larger window where your input might be pulled and be available for the emulation to detect. And that's why the higher the frame delay setting, the much more difficult it is to run the emulation without any problems. Because as you get closer to that 16 millisecond mark, with say frame delay 14 or 15, attempting to squeeze that emulation frame into about 2 milliseconds, this could easily cause a hiccup even on a pretty powerful system.
So a quick note about my latency tests I'll be showing here. I did these tests before using any sort of additional latency reduction beyond just basic run ahead in RetroArch and low latency mode in GroovyMame. And because I was still in the sort of experimental phase and wanted to test out not just the latency but sort of the overall stability and performance, I didn't bother with all those settings during these tests. But later on, I did test these things like hard sync and frame delay, which especially in the case of frame delay can take up a lot of resources. I found that I was pretty much able to shave off that extra last bit of input lag frame in most cases, while still having a bit of processing overhead. But of course, this depends completely on your setup. Although, as you've seen in mine, I'm kind of running this little potato mini PC, and it can still perform frame delay, latency reduction, and not struggle too mightily. Another thing to mention has to do with testing standards, and I really don't want to go too much into testing and lag specifics. But all I want to say is that the whole process of lag testing is surprisingly subtle, and so it's kind of all that's out of the scope of this video. But the one thing worth mentioning is there isn't an accepted standard on which frame represents the beginning of a lag reading. If you look around, you'll find different values reported, and 99% of the time, this seems to be because one tester includes the input frame as a latency frame, while others exclude this frame. I'll be using tests as reference that were done by Mark MSX from Electric Underground and Buffy from Sweden, apparently. And anyways, both have used their sort of, OCD curiosity for our benefit. So I don't really want to get into a nerd war about whose testing standards are better than the others. I'm just using their tests because they're widely referenced. But I thought it worth pointing out that they do differ in their measurement standards. So I'm just bringing that up to avoid confusion when you look around and compare my results. So basically, simply put, Buffy does not include the input frame in his latency tests. So his will appear lower by 1 frame when compared to Mark's tests, who does include the input frame. My personal preference is towards Mark's standard, which I'll refer to as M standard here, in contrast to Buffy's B standard. But that's why my readings will appear standard agnostic, because I will include both measurements to hopefully reduce confusion. Bottom line, though, is everyone is in basic agreement and getting the same basic results most of the time, while there's also always some room for variance based on factors which are difficult to completely remove. Speaking of, I use my Conba stick here to do the test, mainly because the LED lights on the buttons make reading the results easier. The stick does have some latency, between something like 3 milliseconds and 5 milliseconds, but I did enough readings to essentially abstract this added lag variance out. Right, starting out here with the notorious lagster Battlegrega, with GroovyMr and RetroArch able to get down to at least an average 2 frames M standard of lag, which is a full 2 frames better than PCB. The Mr. Core itself tests at the same latency as PCB, pretty high 4 frames, and in many instances actually crawls up to 5 frames for no obvious reason. That's also with the PCB and pretty much everything else that's been ported off of it, I think. So these are actually the low-end readings. And Saturn Core on Mr. also better than PCB, but still not as low as GroovyMr and RetroArch. Esprit on GroovyMr Retro is a full 1 frame faster than PCB. And again, the Mr. Core is same as PCB,
at least 1 frame more lag. Dodonpachi on Groovy Mr. Retro, 1 frame faster than PCB. And Mark looks like he got his down to the lowest possible 1 frame, which we can get to with, all the latency adjustments like frame delay on pretty much all of the games running in RetroArch. But again, this reading is before taking any advantage of frame delay. And again, just to baseline it, the Mr. Native core on par with PCB. So starting to see a bit of a trend. Pro Gear is the same, at least 1 frame less lag on Groovy Mr. and Retro. And then comparing against the Mr. Native core as well. DOJ running under Groovy Mr. and Retro here ends up on par with the PCB readings. And same story with Espagluta, on par with PCB. Now moving away from RetroArch, we're going to look at Groovy Mr. running with Groovy MAME. Muji port here runs a frame better than the Xbox 360 port, and although we don't have a PCB reading here, I'm pretty sure it's equivalent to the PCB readings. Espagluta 2 is on par with Mark's readings on Xbox 360, which also again I believe is on par with the PCB. Mushi-Hime-sama is kind of interesting, as we again see a port that comes out less laggy than the PCB, just like the Saturn version of Grega. But that's on the Steam version apparently, as found by Mark. So our version under Groovy MAME and Groovy Mr. is instead on par with PCB. Mushi Futari is again the same sort of story. I actually recall in the Xbox 360 version, there is a specific setting for the lower latency called 2V, or 2V fast, something like that. So again, the port comes out on top by a frame less lag. Dai Fukatsu under Groovy MAME and Groovy Mr. is on par with the ports, which are also, I think, on par with PCB. And finally, Death Smiles, same story once again, ports as well as Groovy MAME and I believe the PCB, all on par with each other. Alright, finally. So that wraps up the lag test there. Hopefully all of this gives you a better idea of not only how this whole setup performs, but also how it compares against other setups out there. And yeah, I guess that exhausts pretty much everything I want to say about Groovy Mr. and this whole setup I have here. And yeah, hope you find it useful.